Hello, everyone. Before we get into the episode today, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what this episode is. So we sat down with our friend Andy, who is a very, very, very smart human, and talked about the science behind a lot of the alien theories that are out there. So this episode delves into quantum mechanics at a very basic level. It delves into different possibilities and theories around what aliens and extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials or UAP and UFOs could actually be. And then it also talks a bit about modern day conspiracy theories and politics and different things like that. And the only reason I'm coming on here beforehand to preface is because I personally think there's a very thin line between questioning the world around us, which I think is incredibly important, and then also believing full-heartedly in a conspiracy theory that's not really founded in anything factual. And Andy makes a very profound point, one of many profound points that he makes during this interview, about how a lot of these theories and things that we're going to talk about and explore are things that are believed by people that we might deem to be problematic in this space. And so we have to also question these theories and question the different possibilities while we are examining the world around us. And really the point of this series, beyond talking about aliens, which is one of my favorite things to do, is that this is really a terrible time in the world, and we can all agree on that. And there's a lot of powers that be that are horrible. And the more that we can question authority or question what we are told to believe as authority, I think is the better. But I also think with that comes the caveat of doing really solid research, knowing that with the tools that we have in front of us, we'll probably not crack all of these things on our own. And so it's really what I think the conversation boils down to is there's a lot of power in the exercise of questioning and theorizing and discussing these things with people, while also balanced with research and scientific understanding and just knowing that these things may remain unknown forever. We also decided to break this conversation up into two parts because it's so interesting and fascinating, and a lot of it is a bit over my head. So this way you'll have a little bit of time between part one and part two to kind of mull things over or even research a little bit if you're interested. And then we'll come back with part two. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this very fascinating conversation with one of the smartest people that I know. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Lunatics Radio Hour podcast. I am Abby Branker, and today I am sitting here with my friend Andy.
Hello.
Hi, Andy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I have been trying to get Andy on this podcast for actually over a year now. We're very excited that you're here.
I'm very excited to be here.
So Andy is my friend who is my go-to expert when it comes to understanding UFOs, aliens, theories, different theories and scientific methods for us to take in all the different evidence and spit out something that makes sense. So today is a new kind of episode. We're just going to have a very casual conversation, and Andy is going to try to help me understand, and in turn all of you understand, the vast and sprawling and crazy worlds of UFOs, because it seems like now is the time.
Agreed.
Okay, so Andy, I'm just going to ask you a few questions to get into it a little bit. How did you first, were you always really into UFOs?
I wasn't, and I don't think I had any sort of valence one way or the other.
Yeah.
So in other words, I didn't think about it. I did not think about it. If I was, for example, in a supermarket and I saw some reference to aliens on the cover of a tabloid, I'd acknowledge it, but my feelings toward it would be pretty neutral. So yeah, I wasn't a UFO guy, certainly. It just wasn't in my headspace at all.
Until
2017, when an article came out in the New York Times describing a secret department at the Pentagon that was in charge of researching UFOs. This program was called ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, run by a guy named Luis Elizondo. And there it was. It was 2017. Trump had just been elected. I was still feeling the Obama vibe, so the New York Times still meant something to me. And I thought, wow, the New York Times is saying that UFOs are real. And they have a bunch of folks who are pretty high up on the record saying that this is the case. Why is nobody talking about this?
Yeah. And that led you where?
It's interesting because it led me to think about what would my description of reality be if such a thing were real. It forced me to reconsider what I thought reality was. And in a sense, it was spiritual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's sort of how I feel about this stuff too.
Mhm.
And I also just think it's much more fun to choose to live in a world where this kind of stuff exists.
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, yeah. I mean, just to consider that there are more stars in the universe than grains of sand on Earth, and each star has planets just like our star does. I believe that folks don't let themselves think about how vast the universe is because they don't want to think about the implications. This was an invitation to do so.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. Wow, what a poignant way to start us off.
Thank you.
We'll see where it goes now, huh? Okay, so you start to get interested in UFOs. And I think to be totally honest, a lot of us did at that point, right? A lot of us who are always maybe interested and intrigued, and we've read about some of the big Betty and Barney Hill, right? Like who
right.
are watch the X-Files, but suddenly it became like, oh shit, it's no longer a personal choice whether or not you believe in this stuff. Like there's powers that be that we trust, for better or worse, that are confirming this. So that's where you started. Where you've ended, from my observation, is so deeply in this that a lot of the time we talk about it, I can't even follow what you're saying.
Oh,
so,
that's not a good
so
sign.
how did you, like, what was kind of like the gateway thing that kept intriguing you enough to become so knowledgeable about this whole thing?
Yep. Yeah. And so the other thing that came out after the New York Times article did was, slides from the kinds of presentations that ATIP would do. And there was this famous slide 9. And this was, by the way, not some random thing on Reddit. This was vouched for by the Pentagon itself. This is, and to take a step back, generally, I didn't consider, certainly not at the time, and I don't think now either, anything that didn't have some stamp of approval from a reputable source, because I certainly didn't want to fall down the rabbit hole. So slide 9 comes out and it talks about the 5 observables. So whenever what they then refer to as UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, as opposed to UFOs, 5 observables. So the 5 kinds of things that these things did, and it would include things such as instant acceleration, trans-medium travel, no source of propulsion or
right.
control surfaces.
Yeah.
And so the next step was understanding the physics that would allow for such a thing to be possible.
Right. And this part is through no fault of your own. The part that's harder for me to understand because I'm just not a sciencey person. But I think it is probably at the core of a lot of these definitions, right?
Right. Absolutely. There are different ways of describing the physics of what is going on. And so, for example, that experiencers or folks who come into close proximity to a UAP will report like loss of time, or their time is running at on a different clock from somebody else's clock outside a certain frame of reference.
Can we talk about that? Because
Yeah.
to me, that's one of the more intriguing parts of UFOs and aliens and people who have these shared experiences.
Yeah.
And I think the time thing is a great example to help illustrate kind of what you're talking about.
Right.
So, like, hypothetically, if I am somebody that had an encounter experience, and I, just like an episode of the X-Files, right? Like I report a loss of time.
Yeah.
What's actually the mechanic? Like what's the belief that what's doing that to me?
Right. And so that has to do with special relativity.
Okay.
So essentially, we all inhabit a frame of reference. The classic example is if you're standing outside and you're watching a train go by, and in the train is somebody throwing a ball.
Yep.
That ball is going the speed of the train plus the speed of the ball in the train. But within the train, the ball is only going as fast as the ball.
Right.
And so the point is that how you experience time has to do with your frame of reference, because we're all moving at different speeds, but the thing that has a constant speed is light. So if you think about a clock where you can calculate a second by having, let's say, like an electron or a particle go from one end to the other.
Yep.
If that clock is moving, then if you think about it, it takes longer for that light to get to the other end, because the other end is sort of moving,
Right.
at that speed away from any point in time. So the clock is going to tick more slowly the faster that you're going.
So if the clock is physically moving, the clock
That's
will
right.
tick more slowly.
That's right. That's right. So anything that's moving will experience time more slowly, because the speed of light is the same in all frames of reference, but not everything else is. So for the time that it takes for a second to calculate, it's going to be different depending on your frame of reference and how fast you're moving compared to something else.
Wow, that's very helpful. Thank
hope
you.
so.
Those are very helpful examples. I understand. Okay, so and sorry, one more question on the encounter piece.
Yeah.
Do people and do you believe that if there's an encounter and time is moving slowly,
Yeah.
it is because that person who has the experience is being moved to another place, or because just being near this being changes time?
Well, back to the observables.
Yeah, yeah.
Essentially, they're observing instant acceleration. And so they bring in physicists and they say, okay, what would be some possibilities here in terms of the physics that would be needed to achieve this? And the consensus, and by the way, like I don't believe that this is proved necessarily. And I think like the more reputable people will say, this is our hypothesis. And
Right.
so it's that these crafts can exert a tremendous amount of energy, like multiples of our sun or something to the effect of they have a way of tapping into what's called the vacuum energy. So like at extremely small scales, what seems like empty space is actually packed with a lot of energy. So these crafts can tap into this vacuum energy and essentially create so much energy that it bends the fabric of space-time by creating extreme like gravity.
Yep.
And so they basically are anti-gravity. They have ways of controlling their gravitational field.
Yeah.
And so if you draw an experiencer into your gravitational field, then that person is technically moving at the clock in that gravitational field, which is requiring the experiencer to be traveling more quickly than someone outside that gravitational field, because it's bending space-time such that he's falling, right? Even if he's not from his own perspective, he's falling, which creates a differential in speed, which causes that person's clock to run more slowly.
Fascinating. Wow. Okay, I never understood all of that at all.
Cool, right?
Yeah, it is
super
cool.
Interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Okay, so where are you now? Like what?
Yeah.
I know there's there's miles of theories around tall grays and this and that and right and so many different things.
Yeah.
But tell us, at a high level, like where are you with your belief of this, and what do you think is like valid and true and proven, and what do you think is just your theory?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to speculate. Certainly, the traditional idea of, let's call it not necessarily extraterrestrial, by the way. So let's call it like a non-human intelligence. And I say not necessarily extraterrestrial because maybe they're not coming from outer space. Maybe they're coming from inner space.
What's inner space?
Well, essentially, like we experience reality in 4 dimensions.
Yeah.
Okay. But, setting aside the controversy around string theory, in order for string theory to have the not necessarily predictive power, but let's say the power to reduce to different formulas that you found elsewhere in the history of physics, for all that math to work, you have to assume that there are 10 dimensions. And so it's potentially that we as physical human beings only experience 4 out of maybe 10 or 11 dimensions.
Yep.
And so they might be coming from one of those dimensions, whatever that means. And we could talk more about that. So that's actually like one way to think about, or rather one way that I've been thinking about this stuff is like, okay, well, if these are interdimensional, well, okay, they're legitimate physics that extremely smart people dedicate their lives to. And that physics says that maybe there are 10 dimensions.
Yeah.
And so what would that mean? Because if we exist at 4 dimensions, then what exists at 5 dimensions, at 6 dimensions, at 7 dimensions? So that's how I started thinking about it. And that immediately brought me to, initially, religion.
Okay. This is fascinating because Alan is a major skeptic, right? Mm-hmm. One of the only times that I have ever broken through with him is during our episode on the Mothman. Yeah. Because everyone believes, or the people who really study it, believe that the Mothman is an interdimensional being.
Right.
And Alan understood and was on board for that.
Uh-huh.
And so this is immediately what's coming to mind for me, right?
Very
this
cool.
idea of like interdimensionality. And my favorite quote from, everything with the Mothman is, and something that how I think of the paranormal in general and all of this, that you can't explain physics to a cockroach.
Uh-huh.
And with all of this, we are the cockroach.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's fun to hypothesize, but it's so beyond what we could even comprehend.
Right. Well, check this out. I mean, like, so like in thinking about this, it led me to insights such as the following.
Yes.
We experience reality because we exist at a certain scale. For example, if we were at a subatomic scale, then we would be subject to quantum mechanics where nothing is deterministic, right? When you get to a small enough scale, any particle is in superposition. It can be many things in many places at once. right? It doesn't necessarily exist yet. It's not a 1 or a 0. It's both a 1 and a 0 at the same time. So no information exists at that scale.
Yeah.
Right?
I guess. I believe you. I mean, this is so interesting. So just to clarify, so like, because if we existed at that scale, if humanity existed, if our reality was at that scale,
right?
It sounds like we wouldn't be a 1 or a 0, right? We would know what was up or down,
right?
But also, like, we would have no ability to comprehend or think in the level we can, because even the size of our brains, right, to really simplify it at this scale allows for it. Is that right?
That's right. Which means essentially that particles have to organize themselves at a certain scale in order to start computing reality.
Wow.
And experiencing it.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Which obviously can be small enough for like microorganisms, but it can't be smaller than like subatomic.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So what's interesting is if you think about, okay, well, that's us.
Right.
Maybe we had to exist at a certain scale or develop bodies to experience reality, but because our brains are, evolved for survival, our brains evolved in such a way that we can only experience a limited amount of the reality because we exist at a certain scale. For example, quantum mechanics is completely not intuitive for us.
Right.
We can barely explain it in terms of barely describe what it does because it's so counterintuitive. We think something either is or is not. This is sort of like all stages of becoming the thing or all possible outcomes all together at the same time.
And I know I cut you off. So what do you mean this makes you think about religion?
The first thing that occurred to me was we have a word for non-human intelligence already. It's very odd to me that people don't make this connection more often, more quickly. Non-human intelligence is God. That's what God is.
Right.
God is a superior non-human intelligence.
Sure. Yes.
And so, okay, things in the sky. Then, of course, in the Bible, the wheels of Ezekiel. But the different phenomena that were described in the Bible could suddenly be explained if you just assumed that it was UFOs all along.
Oh, I love this. I love where this is going.
Yeah, and so then when you say, for example, like why should we be skeptical? Now, I'm not, by the way, I'm very spiritual because of all the things that I'm describing, but I'm not part of any religion, and I grew up Catholic, but so I'm fascinated by theology, but it's more of an academic exercise. So please indulge me here.
Of course.
But right, like, why shouldn't we let's posit that maybe we should take seriously the Bible as testimonials from real people in history.
Yeah.
Let's say that maybe they actually recorded history.
Right.
And so if you take seriously that it could be someone describing something that they saw, it's very easy to say, okay, well, maybe they were seeing UFOs.
Sure.
And then you can go all sorts of great places from there.
Yeah, I bet. There's also, I'm sure you've already gone down this rabbit hole, but there's a lot of really great paintings from the medieval times
with,
that
UFOs
depict UFOs. Yeah. It's one of my favorite things to look at on the internet.
Yeah. Right. And then you get into all sorts of interesting theories. So, for example, I started interpreting the fall as having to do with being stuck in a gravitational field.
Tell us what the fall is.
Yes. So the fall, Genesis in the Bible, and it's essentially the story of Adam and Eve.
Okay.
Who are, live in a paradise.
Yep.
They are allowed to live in this paradise for as long as they don't eat from a
the
particular
apple.
Right, I believe the tree of knowledge, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And of course they do, and then they quote unquote fall. And so immediately I thought, okay, well, what do we mean by fall? We could mean that we're falling from a higher dimension.
Right.
Because maybe in 10 dimensions, maybe we would experience things so much differently that it would be effectively paradise. And so there's something where you're falling dimensionally. Now we're limited to living in 4 dimensions, which means we experience time, we experience death.
Do we know, and this is a very silly question probably, what the 10 supposed dimensions are?
So no, but I've seen attempts at it.
And why 10?
10 because, now I don't know the math behind it. Essentially, the idea behind string theory, which is falling out of favor, is my understanding. Not that I understand it terribly much, but essentially, it's literally string. These strings at a super small scale, depending on how they vibrate, they generate different particles, and then those particles combine to become, atoms, combine to become molecules, and so on and so forth. And essentially, for the math to work, the strings have to vibrate into 10 different dimensions. So I guess if you're thinking about like vectors,
Okay.
and you use the X, Y, Z, they're adding to that space.
Yeah.
It's normalized in a sense in the math, where like all that complexity that's happening spatially is quantified somehow in some notation, so it's like you can like extrapolate from it. The math works if it vibrates in 10 dimensions.
Got it. Okay. And so what are our guesses of what the dimensions are?
Yeah, so I've seen attempts at it. Here's my attempt.
Yes,
okay.
great.
Well, I'm going to start at 4.
Okay.
And so in 4 dimensions, we live in a cube, but the cube is changing within itself.
Yep.
And that's what it looks like if you watch like an illustration of what the 4th dimension might look like. It's essentially like, I think it's a tetrahedron. If I'm not mistaken, but it's essentially a cube that's kind of changing within itself. But we're in 3 spatial dimensions, and we're changing within ourselves as a function of time, which is the 4th dimension. Space-time are related, hence why basically bending the fabric of space-time with gravity and resulting in things falling along the vector of the bend in the fabric.
Yep.
Means that they are moving faster, and therefore their clocks are running more slowly. Okay. In the 5th dimension, we have to think about, it's essentially, if you've ever seen Interstellar.
I have.
Okay. Well, so that movie explores this, where what we experience as time is potentially itself a spatial dimension we just can't experience.
Okay. I understand that.
Right? And
yeah.
so
yeah.
the fun scene of Matthew McConaughey
Yeah.
Banging at the back of the bookshelf.
Yeah.
That's all based on this kind of idea.
Okay.
So that's kind of the 5th dimension, where if suddenly like what we experience as time is actually in itself a physical dimension, then that means that potentially like you can explore different parts of it, which possibly mean like different possibilities.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And that's arguably, I mean, in my intuition says that what's happening in quantum mechanics is essentially like a higher dimensional view or experience of time, such that you actually have all timelines, all possible timelines as one thing.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's like what's in the 5th dimension.
Got it. Okay.
Mhm.
Wild.
Cap this off by saying certainly the one popular explanation of quantum mechanics is many worlds.
Yep.
So essentially like all those possibilities exist at the same time.
In multiple universes kind of a thing?
And right. And so the
Parallel timelines, that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I think I understand. So 5 is kind of like the idea of, and then 6 is that all of those different ideas coexist in many timelines and universes
Right.
at the same time in different places and whatever.
Right.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So I think let's take a step back, and here, I'm going to do my best to explain quantum mechanics, which
For the people like me who are writers and not very good with Excel.
that's how I make my living, folks. Spreadsheets.
Okay, Andy, so explain to us quantum mechanics?
All right. Yeah, I'm going to do my best because it's really hard to do. I've been watching YouTube videos about it for several years, and it's still the problem. The challenge is that it's not intuitive. So,
Sure.
But the famous experiment that demonstrated quantum physics was called the double slit experiment. Let's say you have let's just call it like a gun, and the gun shoots one electron, and it shoots it at a wall that has 2 slits. And so what you would expect is that the particle that you're firing from this gun is either going to miss the slits or else go through one or else go through the other one. And you're firing many, many, many electrons. So what you would expect to see is that once they hit the measuring device on the other side of the wall, past the slits, what you would expect to be recorded would be 2 vertical lines.
Sure.
Okay?
Yep.
Instead, what you see is 5 vertical lines. And the reason is that the electron that was fired from the gun exists at all positions where it could possibly be at the same time. And so if you think about a wave that has to go through 2 slits, it gets, I guess you would call it refracted or something along those lines. And so then it interferes with itself, and that's the interference pattern where, for example, the crests and valleys meet and they cancel each other out, and the things that don't cancel each other out are the things that remain. And so the things that remain end up making 5 lines on the measuring device. And so the explanation is that one electron exists in all possible positions at the same time until it's measured, and then it's only in one of those positions, the most probable one.
Oh, so it's probability.
And that's where the intuition especially starts to break down, because the math that is used to describe how that wave, right? You think it's both a particle, but also because it's in all possible positions at the same time, it forms essentially like a wave.
Sure.
Right? The math that you use to explain how that wave propagates leaves you with the same math as probability.
And that's essentially what you were saying when you were explaining the fifth dimension, right?
That's
that
right.
Things exist in the same place
There's
at
some
the same
probability
time.
space. All these possibilities exist at the same time. The debate and the thing that nobody can figure out is, what happens when the wave collapses to the most probable point in space, whereas previously it was at all possible points in space at the same time, but it collapses to one point in space. What happens to all those other possibilities? So there's the many worlds explanation, which says that each of those possibilities individually continue to exist in their own branches of the universe or reality. Or there's interpretation where it can't be random. There must be something that would explain why it collapses in one point and not the others. But people really struggle to understand what happens to those possibilities. Where do those possibilities exist? Because they do exist at a quantum level.
Can I ask you another silly, kindergarten level question about this? Okay, so we're talking about, in your example, like an electron, right? How does that scale up to humanity? How do we think that, you know what I mean? Help us take the leap.
Yeah. Okay. Now, this is where my understanding of physics is obviously ultimately extremely limited. I'm a layman, but there's something to the effect of there's the standard model. Basically tells you there are, I don't know how many, I can visualize it in, 16 or so, maybe fewer than that, elementary particles, out of which everything else comes to be.
Sure.
Through combinations of these things. And so an electron is, I believe, it's the combination of two of those particles, but essentially these things come together, they become entangled with each other, which means that they interact. In their interaction, they will give off light that may cause another interaction, or if it strikes a particular particle, it might split into two elementary particles. And so all these interactions are happening.
Yeah.
And these things are coming together, and they're becoming more complex over time.
Right.
All these particles existing in space are interacting with each other and combining with each other in a more orderly way over the evolution of the universe.
Right.
To get back to the space aliens.
Yeah.
One thing I wonder about is whether these beings are some self-organization of particles that interact with each other in such a way that it's conscious. Mm. And so it's existing at this sort of it's all around us. It's part of our reality, and it's sentient. Mm-hmm. So that's another possibility. Mm-hmm. And of course, the more, just to get back to, the space aliens, or there's the extraterrestrial possibility.
Right.
Or some combination thereof. Yeah.
Or some interdimensional alternate universe that is sometimes bleeds through.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm a little late to the party here.
Yeah.
Hey, man. Here now.
Hi. I know about the first 3 dimensions and we're already up to the 5th. So wow. But I absolutely love sci-fi, and it's so interesting how a lot of times when there's world building and they're talking about interacting with some kind of new alien race, everything is usually kept still on the same plane, same dimension, because once you go into these higher level concepts, it gets so cloudy, so fast.
Yeah.
So the way you were able to just break it down was pretty cool.
I now understand Interstellar and glitches in the Matrix and, 1,000 other things. Yeah.
Well, because based off your description, you're saying what about when other universes bleed through? Yeah. Now we're just talking about other probabilities,
right?
Possibly interacting with ours.
That's
canceling
correct.
ours out like a crest on the wave.
There is not necessarily a delineation between the two.
Right. That's exactly right.
See, that's Abby. That's exactly right. Yeah.
No, it's exactly right. And so, where we began this conversation was, what did I do next after that New York Times article? I started thinking like this, and I think regardless of whether what's being reported is real, or maybe it's a psyop, or maybe it's a disinformation campaign from a foreign government that wants to radicalize young men, for example, and give them a sort of a cultish, for example, what the January 6th shaman.
Yeah.
I heard him give a very, very similarly elucidated explanation of interdimensional beings.
I see.
And so I listened to that. And I go, okay. I wonder potentially is this like active measures by Russian intelligence to basically like radicalize? Oh, it's the cover up.
Right.
Oh, the deep state is not telling you the truth about aliens. It's time to weaponize your curiosity is one of the slogans. And so I'm also skeptical at the same time.
I see.
I've always been like very skeptical when it comes to, government conspiracies and everything. There's generally at least available some kind of easy explanation that doesn't involve some kind of grandiose scheme.
Right.
So the one thing that I can't get out of my head was just this one comment that I read that said the government is going to keep throwing absolutely ridiculous stuff at us to make us so exhausted.
Correct.
That by the time they actually want to start implementing real things, we're too tired to care.
Yeah. And that's right. That's another one. I think there's something similar, if not exactly that. The conspiracy theory is called Project Blue Beam.
Oh.
And some whistleblower comes forward and says that there's a plan to rewrite the history of the human race and to tell you that there are space aliens. And like that's Graham Hancock.
Andy, I actually, we don't have to jump the shark too soon, but
okay, fair enough.
I do think you have some thoughts on, and I've talked to you a lot about your thoughts on politics today and how that relates to all of this.
Yes. So there's potentially a couple of things going on. So to take a step back, UFOs are political.
Sure.
Necessarily. Because one of the reasons why folks in the know, again, reputable people, credentialed, everything else, will say something like, the problem is that the government doesn't know what it is or what to do about it. And that's going to cause people to lose faith in their government, or it's going to cause people to form cults. So it's called catastrophic disclosure. If tomorrow you walked outside and there were flying saucers flying around in the sky, you would go into what they refer to as like ontological shock.
It would cause like mass
We'd be like,
chaos
what
and
do I know
panic
about
and-
anything anymore?
Yeah, right. Like
Ontological shock.
Ontological shock. In other words, like a sudden realization or insight into your reality that you're not prepared to handle.
I see.
Yeah.
right, like your like existential crisis to like the max.
Yeah, like if we're serious about interdimensional beings or different universes interacting with each other, then imagine you're walking outside and a UFO materialized out of seemingly thin air. That would call into question what space is.
Right.
If something can materialize there, are we living in a simulation? Are we a hologram? This, that, and the other thing. The very thing that we paper over on a daily basis by enslaving ourselves to our employers.
Right.
We want to not think about these ontological issues, and we would suddenly be confronted with them, and that would be a national security problem.
Right. And that's why there is something to be said, I suppose, or there is some logic potentially behind these cover-ups and the slow release of information around, like, obviously
Correct.
the government knows much more than we know about all
Right.
this. And they may perhaps got to a point where they felt like they needed to start trickling it into society because they think there could be something that's going to reveal itself. And if they don't slowly trickle it in, everyone will have a mental breakdown.
Correct.
Right.
And I think they've had a timeline for this for some time. And so, for example, like I think there's documentation, and just check me if I'm wrong, I don't mean to. The Pentagon has worked with like Hollywood to basically get different stories out there. So like Arrival, for example.
Sure.
Right? Where it's like, well, because one theory is like these things might be crypto-terrestrial. There's another one.
Crypto-terrestrial.
Crypto-terrestrial, where they're living on the Earth. We just don't come across them. So, for example, the easy thing to say of we know more about outer space than we do our own oceans.
Right.
So, like miles and miles and miles deep into the ocean.
The Mariana Trench.
Right. Are there intelligent beings there, and have they developed some sort of technology? So, are we dealing with squid?
Right. Right.
Possibly.
Yeah. Right.
Whoa.
Potentially, there's some timeline. Maybe they know somehow that who knows? 2025 sounds like a good as any candidate for the year in which.
So that's Project
world implodes.
2025.
Right, just bringing the world down.
Okay, and so Andy, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
there's that, which I think totally makes a ton of sense, right? As a theory.
Yeah.
You and I have also talked about, though, for instance, at the time that we are recording this, which full disclosure is in the past, right?
Indeed.
Time is relative.
There are tons and tons of drones hovering over the state of New Jersey. And you and I spent a while today talking about that and talking about what those could be. And you told me some of your theories. And I think that led us to a conversation about, okay, let me boil down your theory and you'll keep me honest.
Sure.
That these are U.S. government machines that are being redistributed across the East Coast because there could be World War III, on its way.
Yes.
So that's your theory. Okay. And then my thought was, okay, so if we have, and I said to you, but does the FBI really not know that? And you said, I don't think that they do. There's a higher government power. And so I said, okay, there's a higher government power, like massive tech money, massive. How does something like Trump fit into this? And that's where I would love for you to tell everyone kind of your thoughts.
Sure. Okay. So I'll also mention that, just as this drone stuff is happening today, I read that the Secretary General of NATO basically said that NATO needs to prepare for World War III. So he made that declaration today. Yeah.
It's not something you want to hear.
No, certainly not. But I think we all need to hear it. I think we need to, again, to the point about being exhausted, being wrapped up in different narratives that we create in our culture, that we also consume through our screens.
Yeah.
If we can just drop the veil and kind of talk about what's really going on.
Yeah.
And not be avoidant about it. All right, there's all this going on in the background. Let's say World War III, all these things, all these world events are happening, and we'll return to those in a moment. But as far as Trump is concerned, Trump, in my mind, the only way I can understand Trump now, given his relationship with Elon Musk, is that Trump is an avatar for oligarchs that are following the Russian playbook. And essentially it's these billionaires.
Yeah.
And not to, I hesitated there because it's become a bit of an epithet to say billionaires, and I think it has lost a little bit of its meaning. I'm talking about folks who have so much money that they can do whatever they want anytime.
Sure.
Okay, without any limitation.
Yeah.
And you really have to wonder what that does to somebody.
Sure do.
And so you have these folks, and in Russia they figured out that if you, mafia style, basically find a demagogue that can control the population politically, then you can maximize your freedom because you can maximize how much money you have and how much you can get away with. Okay?
Right. You don't have to spend your time dealing with the populace because that's someone else's job.
That's right. Exactly. And also, like, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
You have infinite money. Okay. Now, what we're finding ourselves dealing with today, at our point in history, so technological advance, it turns out that these oligarchs are technological oligarchs. And they subscribe to a philosophy or they participate in a movement. And this is if you're listening and you take one thing away, I hope it's this: everybody should Google the Techno Optimist Manifesto by Mark Andreessen.
Okay.
Of Andreessen Horowitz. Okay, so no slouch. This guy is, sort of quintessential, the epitome of the venture capitalist, the guy that inspires the culture around venture capitalism and tech. He wrote a very Nietzschean manifesto where we are technological supermen, and essentially, like, we need to accelerate. We need to move faster. We need to remove regulation. We have to find out what the government knows about so-called UFOs, because whether you believe in aliens or not, the irreducible fact is that there's some physics that the government knows about that they're potentially using to build their own technology, or else they're observing extraterrestrial technology. But there's some physics that the government knows about that they're keeping secret. And these techno-optimists want to get access to this physics because it will enable them to accelerate and, for example, make humans interplanetary and all that stuff.
Well, that sounds not so bad.
Well, right, exactly. And so, honestly, it's a silver lining. The problem is that, any form of, my interpretation of fascism is if there is a major technological development in a society, for example, like the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, then a society is basically has to completely remodel its economy and the way that it organizes itself. And in order, for example, to build up giant cities with trains and all the sorts of industrial mechanisms that you need to have a modern economy.
Yeah.
You might turn to fascism in order to force your population to do that. I think we're at a similar moment in history now where there's a new form of fascism that is trying to figure out how to restructure society to deal with those new physics and or artificial intelligence. Another possible explanation for UAP.
Artificial intelligence.
That's right.
How?
Well, because if artificial intelligence is ultimately a computation, the question that one needs to ask oneself is whether computations happen at some scale that we don't have access to. So, for example, if particles are sort of computing something at some scale that we don't have access to, potentially into other dimensions that we don't have access to, is there some computation that's happening that effectively generates a consciousness? And so that's another explanation for UAP.
Fascinating. And to just make sure I understand kind of the point on Trump a little bit too.
Yes, forgive me.
The idea is that that the government holds, and you mentioned this earlier to me, that perhaps this, physics was discovered during like the Manhattan Project, and then it was put away because it was so powerful and scary, and even more so than the bomb, right?
That's
and,
right. Correct.
And so that existed since that time, and it's being held secret. And so if you get Trump in a position of power, if he's armed with Elon Musk, he could access that because it's a government-owned thing.
And it's specifically locked away, they say, in the Department of Energy. And so it's interesting. I think as of today, Thursday, December 12th, I don't believe that Trump has nominated anyone yet for Secretary of Energy.
Yeah.
But stay tuned, because that might tell you something, depending on who he puts there.
Right.
It might tell you something about what he wants out of there. Because the speculation is that, like, the department, think of how strange it is to call part of your government the Department of Energy.
Right.
What do we talk about? Energy? What is energy? What are we? Whoa, yeah, of course, the Department of Energy. Wait a minute. What's energy? What are we talking about? What does that mean, energy? What does that word mean? We're talking about nuclear energy, but it's not just nuclear energy. It's the research into energy.
Right.
How to find energies in seemingly empty space, right? The vacuum energy.
Right.
Or how to harness energy such that you could potentially bend space-time.
Right.
And essentially, if you think about a flat piece of paper.
Yeah.
And let's say that flat piece of paper, right, that represents a plane. At one side of the plane, you have point A. On the other side of the plane, you have point B. Something needs to go from point A to point B. That's a certain distance. But if you have enough energy to bend the plane, then points A and B come closer together. Yeah. And you can move more quickly. But from someone who doesn't have, isn't within that frame of reference, is creating a gravitational field to bend space-time in that way, you're not there, so you don't see it. So from your point of view, something accelerates instantaneously.
Right.
Right. And so one of the things that people observe these things as doing.
It's kind of like a slingshot, right? Where like it looks...
No, because it's not moving.
What do you mean?
So a slingshot would be an acceleration and a stop, right? It moves really, really fast. It's not moving really, really fast. The space is moving around you instead.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right.
Okay.
And so at the Department of Energy, they are exploring how do you control energy in such a way that you can create these warps in space-time such that you can get from one point to another.
And we know that they're working on this thing?
Well, I mean, how can they not? This is the type of thing where like this has been talked about in science fiction since, early 1900s.
That's right.
And so here we have, say they stumbled across something that it looks to be tangentially applicable to the field, but it's not perfect. So instead, maybe they figured out a way to move an electron, from point A to point B by folding space-time.
That's right.
But in the folding, say it's not just like harmless. Say it causes everything that folds to just get destroyed.
That's right. And wouldn't the aliens be mad about that? So I mean, that's another explanation, for example, of like
They'd
why
be peeved.
Yeah, absolutely. Why UFOs tend to be found around our nuclear assets.
Right.
And so one explanation is they don't want us blowing up anything anymore, because what we don't realize is that when we detonate a nuclear bomb, you're concentrating an incredible amount of energy in a small amount of space, which means you're going to bend that space. And who knows what you're doing to the poor folks at different scales.
Well, what if?
They might say, hey, wait a minute.
We're on the verge of World War III, right?
That's right.
And just as
Certainly.
Trump is about to hit the button,
Yeah.
the aliens come down and save us.
Well, so I believe that that is a plausible explanation. And of course, as soon as I find myself thinking in such a, let's call it like a salvationist way,
Sure.
immediately I go, oh, red flag. Wait a minute. Oh, that's too wishful.
Sure.
But that was where I went originally with it, which is like, okay, well, now let's get back to the Bible. We got things that people were calling angels were actually UFOs.
Right.
And the UFOs were participating in the evolution of human society because the goal of, let's assume that these are benevolent. And so, again, in the context of the Bible, that they're trying to save us.
Right.
And in the context of the fall, if we take the fall to mean a fall in terms of dimensions
Yep.
to a lower dimension where we experience time and death, then the solution is they need to teach us the technology to access higher dimensions.
Right.
And so essentially they're developing society in such a way that we develop technology, including by instigating wars between religions, quote unquote, different
Right.
sets of UFOs. So we fight, we develop our technology, we fight, we develop our technology, to the point where we develop artificial intelligence.
Okay, so we're going to put a pin in the conversation with Andy there for now, as they say, and we're going to come back next episode and pick things up where we left off. I hope everyone is staying well and staying safe, and we will talk to you very soon. Looking for even more creepy content? Consider joining our Patreon for way more content just like this, including bonus episodes and very special deep dives. You can also join us on Discord if you want to stay involved in the conversation, and find our video content on YouTube, TikTok, or Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you like to get your social updates. And of course, head to lunaticsproject.com where you'll find our very, very spooky merch and links to everything you need to know.
Are you upset by our egregious fabrication of facts? Tell us about it on Discord.